Hi, this is John Burness talking to you all, and I am just here to warmly announce my newest podcast, preface it, my newest podcast with Christian Bök, one of the most revolutionary practitioners of poetry anywhere in the world right now. And I had an absolutely wonderful time. It was chaotic, and I mainly just want to do this to give you a preliminary apology for the faulty Wi-Fi that happened to be in the part of the house I was doing the interview in. So we had to take a quick break and readjust until the Wi-Fi approved. So then I would be lying if I said I wasn't pissed off or at the very least a little infuriated by it. But the podcast is finished, and we had an absolutely wonderful, very insightful time. Especially at the beginning of it was particularly insightful. And I sincerely hope you enjoy it or take something away. So, without further ado, here is my podcast with Christian Bök. Hello, everyone. This is John Burness talking to you all from our new eveningisle.com conversation series. And we have a very special, once-in-a-century guest with us today named Christian Bök. Christian Bök is one of, if not the most original and brilliant poet alive today. His work spans almost unimaginable scientific depth and interdisciplinary breadth, making him also one of the widest achieving poets of all time, what I like to call a T-shaped person. His work spans a vast array of mediums, from performance poetry to sound poetry to artificially constructed languages, all the way to bioart. His book, Eunoia, is widely considered a magnum opus in univocalic poetry and won the 2002 Canadian Griffin Poetry Prize. His other big work, the Xenotext, is an ongoing work of bioart of manipulating microorganisms, predominantly on a microscopic extremophile, commonly known as D. radiodurans, to manipulate to each other to where they can reproduce and self-replicate by reciting poetry to each other. And being an extremophile, this will hopefully help the end goal of creating a poem that outlasts humanity and may even reach the heat death of the sun. He is here with us today, and we will be talking about his early convictions to dedicate his life to poetry, the role of other little-known poetries, such as sound poetry, and ultimately what has kept someone driven to dedicating the life to expand what poetry could be rather than displaying what poetry is. So, Christian Bök, I warmly welcome you today.
Well, thank you for the extravagant introduction. I appreciate it, John. That's very gracious of you.
Thank you. Thank you. And then before we begin, I'll just tell a quick story of how this podcast happened because I think it's actually a pretty neat story. So I've always wanted you on, actually, Christian. And but
Sure.
with all the, let's not kid ourselves, all the recent success you have seen in recent months. I mean, you were featured on a Vsauce short, which is a big deal. That's a very big deal in my eyes. And of course, you have this really wonderful video on YouTube by Anthony. How do you say his last name? Is it Mativier? Mativier? What's going on here? Okay.
How are your technical difficulties, John?
Um, Let me see how I'm doing. I can hear you fine now. So with the recent success you've seen, especially with because I live in a large house and their Wi-Fi is all over the place. So with Anthony Mativier or Mativier?
Mativier, I think is how his name's pronounced.
Okay, yeah, with Anthony Mativier talking about your work, I really couldn't imagine we would ever squeeze enough time to do this. And then I was going to do a podcast all about a book called The Sound of Poetry and the Poetry of Sound, by two
Mhm.
people, by Marjorie, Marjorie Perloff and Craig Dworkin. So Marjorie Perloff,
Mhm.
fortunately passed away a few years ago, but Craig Dworkin is well alive. and I asked him if he wanted to do a podcast about sound poetry. And he said that there's probably people alive today that'll be more well versed in sound poetry than him. And he said he would recommend me a few people, and I'm like, sure. I mean, what who do you have in mind? And he only sent me one person, and it was you. I'm like, okay. So I reached out to you, and I'm like, I'm just letting you know,
All right.
people,
Thanks, Craig.
yeah, and then other people
Sure.
want to see this done, and and then I finally asked you on, and given a few weeks in advance, we finally have enough time for this. So it's kind of a neat story. So the first question: so you are a really great example of what I refer to as spite artists, and I've had a lot of them on my show. So James Clear said that we are impacted by three things:
Hmm.
the near, the many, and the powerful. And eventually you'll find out of the
Hmm.
box thinkers who want to branch way beyond their immediate environment and go into very obscure, little known forms of art. And because you're not only a spite artist, you are a spite scientist too. You trained yourself in various scientific fields to achieve your work. So, to getting to your foundations, what ultimately
Hmm.
attracts someone in such a technological age to experimental literature?
Well, my origin story is probably not so interesting. Really, as a young man working uh, to realize an undergraduate degree in English literature, I aspired to become a writer, a poet. And I could write lyric poetry about my personal experience during my time in school with relative facility, good enough to get published. But I feel that I had exerted all of this energy and resources to dedicate my life to an enterprise that I might fail at. So I was very concerned that while I could probably be adequate as a poet, I probably wasn't going to be brilliant. I was very worried about that at the time. Um, and it wasn't until I got to graduate school that I discovered that in the course of my entire undergraduate education in English literature, I missed an entire secret history of literature that doesn't get taught to you typically. That there's a whole avant-garde tradition of writing that, for whatever reason, appealed to me more conceptually than the tradition I'd already been taught. And I was outraged, I suppose, that I was denied access to great swaths of my background. Um, and I discovered, I think, that in the course of that epiphany, I was struggling to become the kind of poet I should be rather than the kind of poet I could be. And there's a difference there. You're given tools, you're given access to resources that can enable, some inborn strengths or compensate for inborn weaknesses. And you don't know necessarily what those are until you've actually immersed yourself within a tradition, taught yourself some skills and figured out how to become who you are. And at the time, this seemed like an eye-opening moment for me. When I was a graduate student in my early 20s, I sat down in front of a typewriter and began banging out just the letter S, but made a shape of an S out of, I think, 5 or 6 S's, and then built an S out of those shapes and a larger S out of those shapes, building just a visual image without any desire to communicate anything, without any, willfulness about expressing myself. And I liked the outcome. It became a kind of germinal activity that fostered a large scale interest in poetry as a concept rather than as a kind of expressive medium. I really wanted to work on artworks that were generative. I realized that I wasn't going to be able to, I think, make an impact by simply reporting about my own experience. Right? I'm a working class kid in a relatively, civilized part of the world without much opportunity for adventure. There's not going to be a lot that I think I can offer by simply writing about my own personal experience. I'm not an astronaut, not a mountaineer, not a person who's accomplished much, as a kid. And I wanted to figure out how I could make a more tangible contribution. And the avant-garde provides a repository of good ideas. of ideas that have either been picked up and then put down, probably too early, experiments or pathways that, could have been explored and were abandoned, or alternatively, speculating about future, means of exploration or adventure that have been untried yet. So, you have this rich repository of ideas that afford a lot of opportunity for exploration and discovery. And as a consequence, I wanted to learn as much as I could about that. And the consequence of which is that now, you become relatively well known for making discoveries and making contributions that are innovative and, as it turns out, not just simply generative, but also expressive. I by happenstance continue then to accidentally speak about my own personal experience, I guess, without ever having to explicitly do so. So I think I've become the kind of poet I could be, rather than the one that I should be, the one that people tell me I have to be. I get to be uniquely my own poet.
Yeah. Do you think experimental poetry, because I think it may not be binary, it could be more than this, but do you think it attracts people who are trying to escape like meaning in traditional poetry, or would you say to your experience, is it trying to reach a deeper, less accessible form of poetry? Is it?
Well, let me put it this way. There's no wrong way to be a poet. There are a lot of poets who I think can't be a poet unless they believe that somebody else is doing it wrong. And I would suggest to you that there's probably no wrong path to take into poetry. And that the various schools of aesthetic attitude, that arise in response to, a social milieu, that are often in conflict with each other. They make claims and manifestos about the writing process. None of these are prescriptively correct. I mean, none of these are, exhaustive in their capacity to encompass the entirety of poetry. I think that if I'm an experimental poet because I'm trying to explore the boundaries of what is conceivable in the milieu of writing. I think that poetry, at least in the long term, over its course of history, has provided an opportunity for people to experiment with language, like to use language in a manner which isn't simply designed to transmit information. Although that can be one of its functions, it's not exclusive, in the domain of poetry. There are other ways in which language can be mobilized for artistic purposes. And you want to be able to resuscitate or rejuvenate your experience within language. I think generationally, you want to be able to come back and find something new in the past or propose, new directions for the future. And if I think that if you're not doing something like that, that if you're not attempting to figure out how to add value, right, to the pantheon of contributors, then there's very little reason to be a poet, I suppose, right? I think you're trying to figure out how to participate in a tradition where poetry has, in the past, founded entire civilizations and sustained cultural, archives of information and transmitted them, throughout epochal time. I mean, we reacquaint ourselves with the past through, the most ancient works possible, right? Poets used to, found entire religions. Every infernal grimoire, about a religion is fundamentally a book of poetry. All of the greatest epics, right, effectively convey all of the information that you might otherwise need to know in order to function within your society. And I think poetry has an important role to play in the conservation of our cultural experience. I was hoping I would make, a lasting impression upon my peers. I didn't want to be a poet who would be forgotten in the course of a lifetime. I was hoping, even now, still to kind of outlive my own mortality, right, through these words, to figure out a way in which I could, kind of guarantee a persistence, I suppose, right, a vision over time.
Yeah, and I would say, the best example of poetry in the past, in particular ancient poetry founding, spearheading religions, would have to be Parmenides from ancient Greece. He only
Hmm.
has one surviving poem on nature, and it's not complete. For all we know, the full manuscript has never been found and
Yeah,
did not survive, but it founded phenomenology and ontology. It's just my favorite example of
sure.
how it could be. And the funny thing about your work, what's really great about it is pretty much everyone except you, I would say, experimental poetry, when they say experimental, they mean it could be semantically, or it could be visually, concrete poetry. But with you, you literally take yourself to the lab and experiment with poetry. You're probably the only person I know that literally takes it literally as an experimental poet.
Yeah,
So
sure. Yeah, to me, language is a kind of technology that we very poorly understand, and it seems so ingrained to consciousness. You're tampering with something that seems fundamental to the actual experience of being self-aware, and it really feels like it's something from outer space. If you're a poet, I think you're kind of working at Area 51, working on an alien technology, trying to reverse engineer this thing that is an anti-gravity machine, really. And a poem, has something strange or uncanny about it. If I think if it's done very well, there's something a bit spooky about the outcome. And I'm always curious, I suppose, about what poetry can conceivably do, especially in areas of expertise where what it was never intended to do, I suppose. Um, Figuring out what language is actually capable of doing
I'm
when
sorry.
freed from certain kinds of constraints or certain necessities, from certain kind of functionalities. What happens to language that's set free in some ways, or perhaps even cornered or constrained in others, right? How can you make language do unusual tricks, I suppose? And despite the rich tradition of options, that it seems like a relatively inexhaustible medium. There's a zillion things to do to try. And each new technological affordance that we encounter with language offers, more opportunities to try something new. So, in this respect, everything I'm trying to do is experimental insofar as I don't know the outcome in advance, and I really am tampering with what feels to me like a tool that we only partially understand, and I'm trying to figure out what it can actually do. Because to me, it seems a bit strange. It seems very weird or alien.
So, assuming that there was like a singular moment, or maybe not, it was maybe a series of multiple moments. Was there a point, in your early life in particular, where this um, this conventional language almost felt experimenting with conventional poetry and conventional language almost felt insufficient, and your experimental approach to it felt like more of a necessity than something to do recreationally?
Certainly, I felt, taking up this vocation felt like a necessity. It feels like a mission more than, a vocation, I suppose, right? It's a commitment, to understand an art form thoroughly in all of its diverse variety. I think takes at least a lifetime of dedication and effort. Um, and I'm curious. I'm just restless in my imagination and would like to know, more about how people do things. Um, I end up reading my peers kind of like a carpenter or an engineer, trying to figure out how they've done something, that I wish I had done myself, and hadn't thought to do. Those works, I think are great because they provide permissions. They show you how to do things that you didn't otherwise know how to do. Um, they also, kind of provide uh, benchmarks, right, for accomplishment, things that you might want to exceed. You can see somebody else has tried something, it hasn't quite landed or worked. It's an experiment that uh, you could probably improve upon. And I would like to think that that's part of the dialogue that you do with your peers, right? Is, you write poetry, it becomes part of a conversation that you're having with both the past and your present moment. You're trying to entice addressees from the future to recall it, and you do this in conversation with other people's work, right? Trying to learn from it while adding value to it. So in this respect, some of the things I was taught, in the course of my training, feel insufficient for that task. Like a great irony, for example, of most creative writing programs is that on the one hand, they profess that they're going to teach you to find your own voice, so to speak, and yet they end up producing almost like a factory, a series of people writing in an identical voice, right? That there's an immense homogenization of technique and personality in these poems. Now, in this respect, it suggests there's a formulaic kind of stylistic set of protocols of techniques that a person can learn that can become codified and are teachable on the one hand. That's encouraging, right? It means at least some of what you do is engineering and transmittable, right, to somebody else, right? You don't have to be an inborn genius in order to be able to write competently. That there are really good rules of thumb. But on the other hand, the fact that there's a suppression of idiosyncrasy, right? An immense pressure to conformity in writing communities is worrying. It just seems to me that, despite, a call for a certain kind of diversity, it's diversity in all things except in technique or in styles or in experiments, right? Or in direction. There's forces, I think, that would prefer to curtail, right, these offshoots, these digressions from an otherwise canonical set of conventions.
Mhm. So now on to something that I'm most excited to talk about
Sure.
is sound poetry. And the reason I'm
Mhm.
so excited by it, the reason I host a sound poetry themed broadcast part-time is because sound poetry, I love, it's kind of like what's in that book, the Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, which is why
Mhm.
pursue something that's complete. And sound poetry,
Mhm.
I think, is a fundamentally very incomplete medium, which is rare these days.
Sure.
Everything is played out. What got me first interested was actually this book right here, Body Sweats by Elsa von Freytag Loringhoven, who
Yeah.
really got me started on it. That's one of my
Sure.
greatest revelations as to what poetry could be. And the reason and I think I know why sound poetry is incomplete because the nature of it is pretty set in stone. We kind of know what it is. It's poetry that is foundationally phonetic and foundationally meant to be performed rather than seen on paper. But on the
Yeah.
other hand, the purpose is very ambiguous. People have,
Mhm.
you have people like who do it for meditative purposes. You have people who do it for to really push literary to the max. So what is for you the purpose of sound poetry? What do you think that foundation is?
Well, sound poetry, poetry that accentuates sound to the exclusion of other features of poetry, that emphasizes sound probably to the exclusion of other features of poetry, has a long tradition, probably as old as poetry itself. Um, it's in this respect, it's not so explicitly expressive. It's not about conveying meaningful statements and propositions and formulating predicates about the world. It takes the entire vocal apparatus of linguistic expression and just dials up the phonic features of language while dialing down other features of the language and minimizing them. So in this respect, for one thing, it shows you that poetry is kind of like a big mixing board in a music studio, where you have all kinds of sliders, right? You could move up and down, right? Accentuating some features while suppressing others, right? You could, suppress the prosaic dimensions of poetry and emphasize their rhythmic features, or rhyme, or euphonies of one sort or another. Or you can, dial up the expressive dimensions of it and ensure that it contains messages and meaningful statements or emotional content, personal experience, whatever. You have these kinds of sliders. You can move them around to generate different stylistic protocols. Different kind of combinations of techniques that define what kind of music, if you like, you're making. And uh, I suppose the two sovereign art forms, probably the earliest of them all, are probably music and poetry. And I suspect that music still has the greater potential for a kind of revolutionary abandonment. It still has the capacity to induce in you a rebellious delirium. I mean, if you can go to a rock concert and walk out and flip a phone booth, right? You could imagine starting, a riotous translation of society, a transformation of society through music, still. it seems less feasible to be able to do that with poetry, even though, poets, had a kind of oracular dimension to their skill sets that permitted them to perhaps found religions or, kinds of magic, if you like. They had an almost hieratic relationship, right, to society. They had a kind of oracular dimension to what they did.
Mhm. And
And it
about
seems less likely you, you could write a
hold on, wait one second.
poem
My Wi-Fi is unstable.
and outrage somebody that they would, flip a phone booth or, right, uh, vandalize a police car or something like that, right? Whereas it's the sound poem to it is pre-linguistic, pre-expressive, the experimentation of the infant experimenting.
One extremely inconvenient Wi-Fi interruption correction later.
Okay.
All right. I'm very sorry for keeping you waiting.
No, it's fine. John, I'm at your disposal. It's my
All right.
great pleasure to be able to help you out here.
Great. Great. All right. So, okay. So we're still recording. Okay. So sorry about that, folks. My Wi-Fi is unstable, so I'm at a different part of my place now, and the Wi-Fi is back and running. So where we left off was that you said music. You were comparing poetry to music in its universality and ancient power, and music has the authority to give us to phone booths after a rock concert. That's where we left off.
Yeah, music still, I think, has an immense capacity to be revolutionary in its impact upon people, to a degree that poetry doesn't seem to be so capable of doing. Although it's probably implicit in its capacities. It probably has that ability. It's just it's an abeyance. And I would think that at least in the modern milieu, at least since, say, Dadaism, the role that sound poetry plays is about starting from scratch with the language. There's some assumption that the language itself has become staid, corrupt, insufficient to expression, and requires complete rejuvenation from the ground up. And in this respect, it attempts to revert to a kind of primordial experience of language that is relatively pre-linguistic as a way of exploring again the set of sounds that are recruitable by the vocal apparatus. In language, at least in English, limits itself to about 40 phonemes. But of course, those 40 noises are only a very, very small component of the entire repertoire of available sounds that the buccal apparatus can actually produce. So it's a curiosity, right, about why some sounds become privileged more than others, why these particular combinations become the defining features of a linguistic ambiance, right? Like, why is it that German sounds like German? Why is it that French sounds like French? How do we, know that we're in the presence of those language, even when people are just speaking nonsense in those languages? We know it's German nonsense. We know it's French nonsense, for example. I think that has a lot to do with our relationship to these acoustic effects of the language itself. And they require perhaps exploration on their own terms. You might want to study those linguistic capacities in a very granular way. And I would think that many sound poets have typically done so. Now, they've done so for a lot of different reasons. There's a kind of thaumaturgic dimension to many of the early sound poets of the 20th century, that they're trying to do something that is spiritual or religious or has a kind of magical or oracular dimension to it, something that would be primordial and pre-exist perhaps, the contemporary, westernized Enlightenment society. Let's revert to something that precedes that. Or alternatively, you may want to indulge in a kind of craft that is more improvised and spontaneous, more delirious or euphoric, that isn't quite so confined by Apollonian structure and formalities that characterize a lot of poetry. You try to evade certain kinds of constraints by resorting to improvised noises and spontaneous effects, figuring out how to make something up in the moment. In that respect, it's more like jazz, perhaps, or other kinds of improvised performance. These are all perfectly excellent ways to be sound poets, but they haven't had persistent kind of uptake from generation to generation. I mean, it requires some concerted effort, I think, for people to maintain those traditions, to learn the body of work, practice it, and reperform it. In the same way that musicians do that dutifully, if you're a classical musician, right, you take up a repertoire of past works, you become good at it, and you do your versions of them, right? You perform them, in concert halls, in addition perhaps to your own compositions or works. You demonstrate certain kind of mastery over a past precedent, and some of that work, in the milieu of poetry is, I think, difficult to reproduce. Or you need recordings of it to understand it. It's not something that's very easily transcribable into scores in the way that music is. Although people have made some very heroic efforts to do so, it's, I think, very challenging to score the human voice in a manner which makes it perfectly reproducible from performer to performer. Um, and now I don't think you would find examples of sound poetry so much among contemporary poets. It's not the poets who are kind of sustaining something akin to that practice. It's something more like beatboxers, perhaps, right? Or
Yeah.
spoken word artists, right? Who are indulging in those kinds of activities. Albeit, for different purposes and according to different sets of aesthetic criteria with perhaps different kinds of precedents informing them. But I would say that if you wanted to know more about sound poetry and didn't know where to look, you have to go to a beatboxer probably to see it in current practice.
Yeah. And it's been said you did a compressed version of, what is pretty widely the most kind of like the paragon, the champion of sound poetry, which is Uswanat by Schwitters.
Yep.
So how, you talk about how difficult it is transcribing it and, setting it down on a literate stance. So how do you go about even rehearsing something like that?
Well, the Ursanata by the painter Kurt Schwitters is widely regarded as uh, one of the greatest works of sound poetry, probably one of the most difficult to perform. It normally takes about 40 minutes to read in its entirety. It is scored for performance, and in this respect, it's relatively straightforward. It's actually possible to kind of dissect how to perform it from the score that he produced. Um, and we have recordings of him and others providing renditions of it. As a young man, I heard an extraordinary performance by a peer that just blew my mind. I thought it was a completely uncanny rendition of it, done with a kind of mechanical precision that doesn't characterize the original performance by Schwitters. The poem is structured like a classical sonata. In this respect, it's much like a work of music. It has four parts that conform to the particular acts, if you like, of a sonata. You can even, if you like, hear the component musical instruments that are being simulated by these, kind of vocal nonsense words. And for this reason, its formality makes it possible to actually commit it to memory and perform it from memory. For a while, at the height of my powers, I could perform that work very quickly from memory in as little as 10 minutes. It normally takes about 40 minutes to do in its entirety, but I could rip through it with a kind of death metal version of it very, very fast as a kind of stupid human trick. And I taught myself the poem, figuring that if I could learn this one, I could learn all the others. If I could do the most difficult one, surely the others would be more tractable. And I spent several months rehearsing, my capacity to perform this work until I became good enough at it that I felt confident I could do it in performance. Now, unfortunately, time and alcohol have taken their toll upon my cognition. I don't think that I could perform any part of it really from memory anymore. Although I feel quite good about performing it from a score, I think I would have to read it aloud, right? With the work in front of me to be able to do any justice to it now. But for
So
a while, it was fun to be able to do it from memory. It would induce in people a sense of amazement to see it performed.
So with you like fully immersing yourself in it and almost becoming intimate with this work, what has Uswanat become to you? What does it mean to you?
Well, it's an important precedent, I guess. You look at it as a work that is a paragon of its form, and It offers permissions. You learn a lot about how to write perhaps a sound poem from a work like this. Um, uh, for me, I just look at it as a an important canonical work that has trained me, if you like. It's part of the disciplinary regimen that I had to take up when I wanted to understand the history of the avant-garde. I wanted to know about every single school of the avant-garde and become apt at as many of them as I could, right? To be as good as I could possibly be at any given kind of poetic style. And that work, is foundational, I suppose, for that moment in my career when I was curious about how to be a sound poet. So, I've mastered some of that work, and it feels very good to become apt at it, to sustain, I suppose, a kind of intergenerational transmission of that skill. But it is a highly idiosyncratic area of interest in the history of poetry. It's not something that it's very easy to popularize, right? No, it's a challenge, right, to get people excited about it,
Yeah.
even though they're amazed when they see it, right? They understand that it is a sublime thing to see performed. I don't know, something about its athleticism might be intimidating, something that, about the complexity of it might be intimidating to people who want to learn it. Um, but in my case, I just wanted to become excellent at things, and of course, you aspire, right, to become good by emulating the best thing.
And when you engage something so deeply in something that is rooted in phonetics and sound, rather than semantics, when you take into account, the most foundational parts of the traditional poetry, the message, the semantics, the pattern, the structure. So what gave sound poetry when you immerse yourself in Usmanot in particular? What gave you the most meaning in that? Was it the sensation around it? Was it the energy? Was it the structure? Is it something harder to articulate?
Well, I mean, the work is a very formal work. It's elegant. It's got mathematical structure to it. It's got riffs and forms of repetition in it. Rhyme throughout it. I mean, in this respect, it's very musical. It really is like a work of music. And it's Apollonian, if you like, in its creation. But when you perform it, it induces a more Dionysian experience, right? It's more delirious or euphoric or rapturous, right, to perform, and you get lost in it, right? It's a way of experiencing a bit of vertigo, I think, and you hope to be able to transmit that excitement, to audiences, right? You're trying to showcase this, rapturous outburst, this extraordinary euphoric experience in music. And convey it with through this bodily discipline, through this virtuoso athleticism, right? It requires some skill to pull it off properly.
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of like watching a violinist play a really tough combination of chords very quickly, right? It seems amazing that it can be done, right? You look at it and it seems inhuman that somebody could do it. And I think that that's part of what excited me about it was like demonstrating that I had the capacity, despite not thinking I could do it. That you can learn to acquire some of those skills, and for that reason, it also perhaps lends a bit of support to ambition. You could say, okay, well, I've mastered this thing, well enough that I could perform it well, and it exceeds what I thought was my own potential. Maybe I could exceed, other forms of potential. Maybe, I've got other hidden attributes I didn't know I had. Maybe, it's just a matter of willfulness, I suppose, right, to overcome certain limitations, right, in your skill sets, to do something fantastic. And I think really that's fundamental to most artistic activity. It's just a hard-nosed willingness to do difficult things, right? Try to overcome hard obstacles.
So when you attacking this one in particular, this poem, um, what would you say, like, because with my two conclusions, did you feel you were kind of uncovering something, within this poem, within this, I would say almost disappeared work, or were you more were you taking a more original, inventive approach, like almost generating something that wasn't in the poem in the first place?
Well, in the course of reading it and getting apt at it, you start experimenting with it. I mean, for me, listening to Eberhard Bloom do his version of it, in which he's an elocutionist. He pronounces every note, every sound as though it were a rivet, right? It's very quick and precise and pristine. Whereas the original performance by Kurt Schwitters is more liturgical. It feels almost like a Martian opera, a little bird song, right? The opening he would read would begin something like "Thim spavatetse pagif kvie didis I So you've got these incantatory elements to it, right, that are a bit thaumaturgical, right? They seem a little magical. Whereas, Eberhard Bloom is more like a machine, a robot, right? Kind of fed passion fruit and expected to perform this thing, very precisely. It's Fims, Baba, Tetsu, Bigif, Gwi, Dudus, right? Totally different kind of intonation and precision, something a little more mechanical, perhaps, a little more inhuman. And I think these are reflections of temperament, right? I mean, somebody sitting and playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right, on a piano is going to inadvertently add their own timbre, their own personality, their own idiosyncrasies, right, to the rendition of it, right? Everybody's got a different vocal apparatus. Everybody's going to sing, I think, in slightly different tones and timbres and keys, that inflect the inadvertencies of our own personality, right? And sure enough, in the course of learning how to perform the Ear Sonata, I end up figuring out some of that stuff for myself, right? I begin to try to perform it more quickly to see, if I can hold it in my head while, enunciating very, very fast. There's no reason to do that. In fact, it probably does damage to the original work. It's probably, undermines or subverts much of its beauty in the way that speeding up any, work might vandalize it. But, also learn things about it that I wouldn't otherwise know if I hadn't, right, started to riff off of it, right, kind of play different notes around it. So that work for me is something like a learning experience, right? It's part of the gymnasium of my background, someplace where I got my exercise, figured out how to be the kind of poet I could be, right? It's one of the places I worked out.
Yeah, it's amazing. I had somebody taught me this incredible revelation. It's totally relevant to what we're talking about because you talk
Mhm.
about music and poetry and athleticism. And I remember I learned only about this a few days ago, and it almost challenges what humans think is difficult versus what actually is. Because, talking is actually more athletically complicated than playing any musical instruments with
Well,
our
I think that would be a very interesting claim to make.
it's
Mhm.
based in science. Yeah, when we play
Sure.
our guitar with our up to our forearm, we're playing no more than 50 muscles. But
Right.
when we speak, which is something we don't even think about, it doesn't even occur to most people that it could ever be
Sure.
difficult. It involves well over 100 muscles in several
Right.
different internal systems, including the respiratory system. So
Right.
it's almost it almost challenges what we think is difficult, but yet something that is empirically more difficult doesn't seem to be obvious to us that it's difficult.
Well, I mean, language probably had an important role to play in selecting for intelligence. Like to me, language is so imbricated in consciousness that it would seem to me that it coincides with the advent of self-awareness. And it probably grows out of musical expression. It seems to me that that's the
Yeah.
simplest form of cognition that is proto-linguistic. In this respect, music is the queen of all arts and probably transcends poetry because it precedes it probably in the evolutionary development of the brain. But language, though, allows us to alter the world, right? It's software that can, permits us to command armies and, say, deliver instructions, right, and transmit information across epochal time. Whereas music feels like I think it attacks more limbic systems. It grabs on a hold of more primitive parts of the brain. to manipulate us. And for that reason, it's perhaps even more effective in guiding our motivations and emotions. Perhaps more so than language. Language has a kind of, again, an Apollonian dimension to it, which poetry attempts to recruit, right, for purposes that have nothing to do necessarily with management of information, the transmission of instructions, or the conveying of knowledge, right? It has something weirder at stake in it.
Yeah. And so now on to the next topic. Something that I really want to get into because I've hardly seen anyone talk about it yet. I think it's equally as impressive as the Xenotext. Is you I've read in the research that you had a say in designing the artificial languages in at least two television series, one called The
Yeah.
International Conflict by Gene Roddenberry, and the other called Amazon by Peter Benchley. And then I also have this with me too. I do happen to have the 90th anniversary of the Codex
Yeah,
Seraphinianum.
it's a wonderful book, that book. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's I would say it's probably like the encyclopedia of the imaginary language. So uh,
Mhm.
so tell me all about the process of that. Where do you even begin with constructing a language, like trying to simulate how language might evolve, exploring possibilities that human language has never accessed? Where do you even start with that?
Well, that experience of designing a language for a television show for Gene Roddenberry's Earth Final Conflict was just a happy accident. It's a colorful line in my CV for sure. I only got to work very directly on scripts for a year before I was let go from the production. Um, in part because the use of the language was not central, I suppose, to the storylines, although they had hoped they would incorporate more of it into their plot devices. They never really did. I was asked to come up with a proposal. I offered, some speculative ideas about how I would design such a language, and the producers, at least, were fascinated enough to let me participate. And they wanted a truly alien language. And even when we look at languages in human cultures around the world, they have a lot in common with each other. There are features that are probably commonplace across the entire spectrum of languages on the planet. And this would conform to Chomsky's notion of deep structures in all linguistic activity. And that might very well be true. I was doing my best to, kind of imagine alternatives to that. I guess if I really want an alien language, what would it be? And at the time, I thought, well, imagine a society where Newtonian models of the world are not the norm, but more quantum mechanical models are the intuitive norm. For us, quantum mechanics is not intuitive. Our vision of the world is really defined by more classical physical models, right? In which there are things that, to which actions can happen, and actions can, induce changes in things that are tangible, right? That are, fixed, I suppose, in their identities. Whereas, quantum mechanics, plays very loosely with these ideas, right? There are no things, so to speak, and there are no actions even really that in the sense there's no nouns, there's no verbs. So what would a language be if it had none of these things, right? It had that we typically identify with tangible objects and predicates that are actions. So I tried very gamely to imagine a language that in which nouns and verbs were the same part of speech, in which every action also implied its opposite at the same time, so that when the aliens, for example, would say that they were coming in peace, this is in fact how they would wage war. They waged war through peaceful means. So like announcing that you're coming in peace is really a way of telling you that you're about to be colonized, right? Right, and that this would be implied, in the language itself. Whatever you said would likewise mean its opposite simultaneously. Um, and I came up with linguistic translations of statements that the aliens would make. I made them more metaphorical or more poetic, in a manner to add, some color to the dialogue in these stories. I even ended up writing an alien hymn that unfortunately never made it to air. The challenge was that actors couldn't actually perform the lines. Like the language was a kind of defeated some of their vocal training. They didn't have to do much except aspirate their vowels when they spoke the language and trill their R's. And I would have thought that those two sound effects would have been relatively straightforward for anybody who was trained as an actor. But I guess actors aren't typically trained to trill their R's, and they would forget to aspirate their vowels. So, if you wanted to say something like "We come in peace," you'd say and it sounds really great. It sounds alien. Really says that, right? But the actors weren't up for it, unfortunately, and so it didn't get incorporated into the dialogue with the frequency that I might have preferred, and eventually just got to kind of evicted from inclusion in the show. But I still have that material. I still have the concepts that I generated by the dictionary, the tentative linguistic notes about it. All of that's still around on my desktop somewhere. And I've occasionally performed as sound poems some of that work as a way of at least showing that labor didn't go to waste. But as a side effect of consulting on that show for a while, I was then also invited to design languages for Peter Benchley's Amazon. And there, I had to come up with a variant of the English language that would have a Shakespearean dimension to it, under the understanding that ancient explorers from the 15th or 16th century, 16th or 17th century, managed to find their way to the Amazonian jungles right after being shipwrecked at sea and maintained their cultural experience in this anachronistic linguistic mode. So that was a totally different set of exercises. And again, did that for a year, consulting on scripts and contributing to the languages for that show. I had to come up with some sort of Amazonian language that didn't exist. I had to come up with a kind of variation of English that didn't exist, and it was fun. It was fun to do that. But I was young, and television is a collaborative effort in which you have 100 hands on a paintbrush trying to draw a straight line, and it's impossible. Right? The line gets very crooked, and eventually, if somebody demands that it be a straight line, it goes in the direction of the money. Right, like the person who's got the most money on with their hand on the brush is the one who draws the line. So, that was a fun experience, and it constitutes a colorful bunch of lines on the CV, but didn't have a grandiose impact upon my career. Unfortunately, I didn't make a lot of money doing it. I didn't earn a fixed place in television writing or television history, but it was fun to be a poet in those environments. It was interesting to do that.
Well, you know what E.M. Forster said, you've confused what's impressive with what's important. So
Yeah.
very rarely the same thing. So
Right.
when you did construct these languages for these shows, was there at any point where the language, at least to an intuitive extent, where the language became real, rather socially or cognitively speaking?
No, I mean they're inventive languages. And they're. I mean, a language is sustained by the number of speakers, right? It requires social engagement, and it's also plastic enough to undergo change, right? People, contribute to the language that they use. They have the capacity, I suppose, to alter it over time. In this respect, the most successful artificial languages are not, as you might expect, the ones that were intended to provide global diplomacy or global ambassadorship, right? Esperanto, a language that everybody would adopt as a way of communicating across their separate languages, right? A way of eliminating the curse of Babel and ensuring that we had a common language that we could all mutually understand. No, the most successful artificial language is now Klingon. That has the largest body of speakers with the largest amount of literature written in it. Certainly the most kind of cultural cachet and lasting impact. There are way more speakers of Klingon than there are Esperanto.
Mhm.
And inevitably, what I think is happening is that whatever function Esperanto set out to fulfill as a global lingua franca for everyone, that's being fulfilled by whatever language will end up becoming the predominant hegemon on the planet. And, that so far seems to be English. But it could be, Mandarin, or it could be, Spanish, or it could be something else in the future. But for now, English seems to be at least as a spoken as a second language, that's the lingua franca, right? English as a second language seems to be the predominant artificial language that survives, us all.
Yeah. And then now to our next topic, this is just something I want to ask on a personal standpoint because I do feel this can invite a lot of interesting insights. So I'm just going to share
Sure.
my screen real quick because when I was looking for like photos of, to use to promote this, I came across this amazing photo of you with Dan Dennett right here,
Mm.
having a laugh. And that is,
Yeah.
it's very amazing photo. Now, how do I stop sharing? Let's see. I'm not great at this. So there we go. Stop share. So yeah, Dan Dennett, and I'm not the only person that thinks this, but I think he's easily the best philosopher to come out of the 21st century. Very much of a Humean-like thinker, asking
Sure.
questions that have taken into account the entire cosmos, not just concerning ethics or
Sure.
human ethics or animal welfare or logic. So yeah, what impact has Dan Dennett had on your writing or even your life outside of poetry, considering that?
Well, it was a great privilege to meet him. That photo that you have is taken in Northern Australia at a social event in honor of a visit that he made to Charles Darwin University. And of course, he's a pretty staunch exponent of Darwinism. He's a member of the Horsemen of Atheists, right? Who
Yes, of course.
promoted atheism in the latter half of the 20th century as an intellectual norm. And he was invited to be a guest speaker to celebrate one of the anniversaries of Charles Darwin. There's only one university that is the namesake of Charles Darwin, and it's in Northern Australia. It was a great privilege to work at that institution. Really liked being there in this bizarre tropical paradise. And we invited him to come and attend, and he was very sporting and came and spent time with us. Um, I certainly have read essays by him about consciousness. He was very curious about, his relationship or understanding of machine intelligence, that kind of thing. And he was just very, very good conversationalist.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, but I would simply say he's part of the background radiation, I suppose, of my intellectual life. Like there are many, more important scholars to me than Daniel Dennett, but my encounter with him was rewarding. It was fun to meet him and spend some time intellectually with him. He was very cordial.
Yeah. And like I've pointed out with you, with the incongruence between, achieving your potential and garnering success, especially with your languages. I actually, with what you said, I do feel it's almost a tragedy that it does appear he's going to go down in the history books by the largest number of people as one of the Four Horsemen, people who
Yeah.
demolished creationists, demolished religious, where I think he probably was the best in the world at trying to understand consciousness,
Hmm.
very holistic perspective. And that's just another incongruence we have to face. So
Hmm.
now moving on to merging poetry with non-poetry.
Sure.
It seems to redefine what poetry is. For example, it shocks me how many people, because when I was in college, I was a child psychology major, and it amazes me people don't even know the origin of the word psychology, which is psychologism, which means
Mhm.
that psychological aspects of a person impact non-psychological aspects of a person.
Sure.
With all that mind mapping out there, do you see your non-poetic skills as tools as a service, of poetry, or as a parallel systems that poetry intersects with it, or is it not connected and you try to make it connect artificially, or how naturally is it all connected, the poetry with the non-human?
Well, poetry is a set of technical affordances, with language. And, language touches pretty much all human endeavor to one degree or another. And for this reason, I might, argue that poetry constitutes an implicit feature, perhaps, of most of human endeavor, that you could conceivably uh, use poetry as a means of understanding something, right? Of getting at something. or alternatively, right, that pretty much every one of the human domains provides fodder for poetry, right? The poetry is something fundamental, perhaps, to our experience of, or our aesthetic experience of consciousness. That a life without it is diminished, I think. In the same way that a life without music would be diminished, or a life without, an experience of painting, right, would be diminished. It's one of those affordances, right, that make you human. And now, my training was relatively polymathic as a young man. I'm working class. There's not a lot of higher education in my background. I'm probably the most educated member of my entire family tree, my entire gene pool, going back to the Vikings. I'm probably the most educated person who's ever, been spawned from that set of descendants. And the training I received was very polymathic. I was much better at maths and sciences than I ever was at English literature or the humanities. But my passions lay, I think, in the humanities. And as a consequence, I, pursued, I pursued what I was interested in more than I pursued what I was good at. I still retain, though, all of that investment in the sciences, certainly in its methodologies, the scientific method and its skepticism and its empiricism strikes me as a very useful way to approach the world. And I haven't forgotten all of that training, and I really would like, to apply, right, whatever, tools I've got in my kit. They all seem applicable to figuring out how to be a poet. Historically, poetry used to be the repository of truth, but it has been, gradually, if not summarily, displaced by the sciences from that particular function. Poetry is no longer the quorum for truth telling. Science has probably become, the sovereign quorum for truth telling. And poetry resents that, I think. Like there's if I'm speaking among poets, I think they look at science as everything that poetry is not. Whereas poetry might rely primarily upon an ambiance of metaphor. Science probably tries to resist metaphorical explanations for things, right? It's trying to get at the tangible, explicit directness of things rather than speaking and through analogy about stuff. And my interests in the humanities, are characterized by that split, between the sciences and the arts, because I think, of course, they have much to contribute to each other. They constitute flip sides of a single kind of coin, perhaps, that they partake of the same currencies. And that at this moment, we probably are living through a period of aesthetic upheaval or cultural upheaval that is reminiscent of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. You're about to spawn entire generations of highly skilled people across a diverse variety of domains of knowledge that are radically different from each other. And that will probably unlock an immense amount of creativity. We're probably on the threshold of seeing an extraordinary, flourishing of the arts. And I, want to be able to participate in that, or at least contribute meaningfully to that. So, right now, I would say that I became a poet in part because I thought I would get to be the most imaginative person in the room. But that's not true. I think the scientists are, in many respects, more imaginative now. That a typical scientific paper is way more surreal or crazy than anything a poet could conceivably say, right? It's certainly more hermetic or hieratic or magical probably than anything a poet could conceivably say. I mean, because it's addressing things that are just plainly weird to a degree that poets used to be able to call upon, right? And I'm mystified, for example, that poetry can't really engage that milieu very well, or at least historically hasn't figured out how to do that, except resistantly, right? If I were, for example, to ask you what your favorite poem about the moon landing might be, I doubt that you're going to be able to name one, right? Even though, from my perspective, the moon landing is very important because it's my first memory that I can date. It's my very first memory. I would have been just shy a few weeks of my third birthday. So at that moment when you're arising into consciousness, becoming sufficiently self-aware, linguistically immersed, at that very moment, my first experience that I can recall is the moon landing, watching, a little ghost step off a ladder onto a gray world. And that is tantamount, I think, to saying that my first memory, my first coming into sentience, is equivalent to saying I saw a lungfish flop out of the ocean 400 million years ago. And the event is probably as important as that event. The moon landing is probably as important as sea creatures, exploring the land for the first time. It indicates a key step in our evolution beyond the cradle of the earth, the first set of organisms to willfully leave the planet and set foot on another world, to escape our own gravity well and potentially explore the stars. And if you can explore the stars, there's nothing that will wipe you out. Your extinction is extremely unlikely. If you can escape your own sun, there are no forces of nature that could wipe out your civilization. And yet, there's no poetry about that. About that event.
Xenotext might survive.
Well,
Bacteria might survive.
there are efforts, in part, maybe among experimental writers to begin to infringe upon this. But if the ancient Greeks had written, if they had in fact, rowed a trireme to the moon, you can bet there would be 24, epic books about that, right? There'd be a great epic work of 24 books, right? And what occasions an actual epic is a bunch of pirates going to rescue a fishwife, right, from a distant fort. That's worth writing 24 books of epic poetry about. And even though we've got intercontinental battles and extraterrestrial voyages that would rival the actual experiences of Greek gods, none of that experience finds its way into a poem. There are no poems, epic poems about the Second World War, or about atomic weapons, or the moon landing. To me, the moon landing is the extraordinary event. And it's weird to me that I'm alive at this moment when I get, my earliest memory is going to be this important evolutionary moment. Humanity steps foot on another world. And it occurs bizarrely, and from a geological standpoint, a cosmic standpoint, in exactly the same moment, in the blink of an eye, we're about to see, and as a species, we're about to witness the next most important step in our evolution, right? Before we've even embarked on this other one, we're already going to be overwhelmed by an even bigger one, right? The arrival of super intelligence, silicon-based evolution, right? That will rival, our own. And that occurs simultaneously. You're going to, in the course of your lifetime, you're witnessing two immense transformations, right, in the evolution of life in the cosmos, and they're occurring almost at the exact same time. It's very strange to me. And again, how will poetry, function within that milieu? Normally, poetry is responsible for sustaining cultures over epochal time. We know something about Aboriginal culture because those songs have been sung for 40,000 years, right? We know something about our prehistory because of it. We know something about ancient Babylon. We know something about Sumeria. We know something about ancient Egypt and Mycenaean culture. We know things about those cultures because people spoke to each other in poetry and sang to each other these songs in an effort to remember it all for thousands of years, right? Before writing ever existed, before it was possible to store everything in durable archives. So I guess that's why I'm interested in areas outside the milieu of poetry. I would like to think that they're no less applicable, right, to my capacity to make a poem.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about AI in a little bit. And the last question I have about you with your intersection between poetry and non-poetry. So when you're I guess you still are in the process of with the Xenotext and very much bridging poetry between very hard sciences. Do you ever feel like a risk that, especially taking into account that you wrote the poetry for the microbes, do you feel a risk that the poetry could become diluted when it moves into non-humanity spaces?
No, I think in the case of the Xenotext, that was a big risk embarking upon such a project. I began it about 25 years ago in an effort to write a poem in such a way that I could encipher it as a genetic sequence and then subsequently implant it into the genome of an organism, replacing part of its genetic code with my poem, so that the organism would now become an example of living poetry. It would be embedded in an actual living thing. And while lots of artists and scientists have since then, stored information in genomes and demonstrated that you can reconstitute it, you can read it back. And in my case, I wanted the work to actually transform the behavior of the living thing, that it would recognize that it had this poem embedded in its genome and respond to it. And so, trying to write a poem in such a way that it can survive in the genome of an organism while causing the organism to understand it as a set of instructions for building a protein in response, very challenging. So the organism would read my poem, it mistakes it for a set of genetic instructions for producing a protein, and it builds a molecule, a sequence of amino acids that is itself an encipherment for a totally different poem that also makes sense and speaks back to mine. So already a very challenging kind of set of constraints. I have to build something that will persist durably in the genome of an organism without compromising its functions, and yet contribute to its capacity to make something that would endure in the organism viably, and it would be capable of being reproduced in the organism without damaging it, and be persistent enough to be detectable. We could actually characterize it or conceivably read it. Moreover, I wanted it to last. So, I selected a host organism that's extremely durable. It's capable of repairing its own DNA so quickly that it doesn't mutate very easily. It doesn't change. So it's very unresponsive to evolutionary selection. Doesn't evolve. Normally, things that don't evolve die out, right? Obviously, if they can't adapt and mutate, they can't change. But this thing is already so well adapted to the utter lethality of the universe that it doesn't need to change. It's an evolutionary dead end that is very well suited to just survival as a function. You can scorch it, freeze it, wither it, and it won't die. You can blast it with 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that would instantly kill a human being, and it won't die. It can survive in the open vacuum of outer space. I mean, these are very hostile biomes, places that normally living things would disintegrate or disappear in. And it can persist in them. There's no real understanding, I guess, about what its native habitat might be, how it might have acquired all of these immunities, because there is no environment on the Earth that has these diverse extremes, really, except maybe an extraterrestrial environment. It could be that the organism spent part of its terrestrial evolution in outer space before being returned to the Earth. Maybe, it's an extravagant speculation, but it's a poorly understood organism. Nevertheless, in its surreality, by putting, my poem into this particular host, I've effectively written a book that can outlast terrestrial civilization, and it might be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. I mean, I've deliberately set out to write a book that will be immortal. And I succeeded at that task. The book came out in 2025, documenting the outcome of this exercise after 25 years of effort. And it wasn't certain, of course, that any of this was possible. And in fact, at the time I started, it wasn't probably feasible to calculate the odds of failure. I would assume that failure was very likely, but in my mind, I thought surely it's technically feasible. It's got to be something that can be overcome through some engineering or study, through some scientific research. Surely I can solve a problem like this. And as it turns out, it's actually very, very difficult, extraordinarily difficult, verging on the impossible. The raw odds against succeeding at this task are 1 in 1 novum quinquagentillion. It's a number 1 followed by 172 zeros, a number so vast that there is nothing really in the universe that you could conceivably count using
When a word takes a long time to pronounce its non-mathematical formulation, I can only imagine how big that number is.
No, it's a giant number. It's, as I said, it's a 1 followed by 172 zeros or so. And, these are conservative odds, right? They could conceivably have been larger, but now that's it's cosmically improbable, the thing I accomplished. Suggesting, I might be the luckiest poet ever to have ever lived, in the history of literature. I've certainly embarked on a task that is probably the most difficult literary endeavor ever undertaken by any writer in the history of literature. The constraints under which the thing had to be written are so onerous that it might be the most constrained poem ever written. The only thing I can think of that might be more hard, harder to have written based on the constraints might be The Star Gauge by Xu Hui. It's an extraordinary visual poem that is a highly complex palindromic grid of words that can be read in thousands of different ways, all intelligibly, all beautifully. It's an extraordinarily supersymmetric kind of poem that just seems inconceivably complex, and yet is written according to an extraordinarily difficult constraint. And yet, this thing, I had to write is, in some respects, the side effect of constraints that are implicit in the genetic code and the structure of the English language. So, in some way, I've not written this thing, right? It's not the product of my creative effort. I've discovered it as one of the possibilities implicit in the constraints. And given that there's only one way to do it, the odds of it existing are that improbable. It seems to me inconceivable that I could have found it. It's not so much that I've written it as I've found it. And pulling off that task, under great duress, with a lot of heartbreak and setback, was an immense challenge. And of course, the world of poetry is not exactly responsive to this achievement, right? It's on the one hand, the Xenotext polarizes opinion among poets. Either I'm a grandiose genius or I'm a grandiose fraud. And while I'd like to think that the former are closer to the truth, right, the people who are hostile to this enterprise are far outnumber probably the people who are impressed by it. And that's worrying, right? I'm trying to do something that I think would distinguish me as a great 21st century poet, try to write something that will be irrefutably magnificent. And accomplishing this task, has kind of not exactly resulted in ticker tape parades. Right? It's something that goes relatively unnoticed so far. Right? It's the response to it has been muted. I'm proud of the achievement, of course, and I'm grateful I got through it. I look back in some wonderment that I had the wherewithal to endure it, and I hope that I never have to persevere through something so difficult again. I hope that I get to do things that are easier to do, but I'm probably the poet best known for doing things that are impossible, that are truly difficult.
Yeah, and I remember you saying one time, I remember you said this on another podcast, how even after you finished it, it wasn't exactly a euphoric dopaminergic
Mm.
satisfaction to it. It was more like this thing could have gone so horribly wrong in so many ways that it's almost like you survived it rather than you accomplished it.
Yeah,
So,
I feel that the feelings, the emotions I had when I got notification of the success of the project finally, uh, were post-traumatic. There wasn't a sense of relief or euphoria or excitement. It was the feeling that I have avoided some horrible nightmare, that I've managed to survive something really devastating and difficult, that I'm lucky to have gotten through it alive, wounded but relatively unscathed. And it took days for me to recover. I was really quite depleted, by the experience. And so I don't recollect it, with much fondness. I look back now, upon that person who did all that, wondering who he was. How did he do it? Like, it's like standing at the top of a cliff that you've climbed, an otherwise impossible cliff, a sheer cliff face. You spent 25 years climbing it, and then you managed to get to the top, and you've lived through the whole experience without falling to your doom, right? And you've managed to survive it, and you wonder, how it could be done. Like, I don't think I could fathom trying to reproduce that result. It put me, at the utmost limits of my aptitudes, for
yeah.
sure. I've really done something superhuman, I think.
So with all these troubles you talk about, and even, afterwards, having a not so positive uh retrospect on it. So what ultimately, and this doesn't have to be, I don't think this has to be the same thing as what are you empirically trying to accomplish, but what was in your mind the most the biggest reward? What was that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for you on this?
Well, it's the notion you're blessed, I guess. You know, um, there's no good reason for me to have succeeded, really. Like the odds are so stacked against me. I mean, at cosmic scales, right? The to have been lucky enough to figure out how to do it, um, is against many obstacles. I mean, both not just simply the conceptual obstacles or the kind of empirical and technical difficulties of trying to do the science, all of those things that are characteristic, right, of trying to invent something, right, trying to make a discovery. It's all of the sabotage, right, that your peer group has undertaken against you, right, like the transcending all of the obstacles that your community places in front of you, right? I mean, there are a lot of people, I think, whose temperament is to boo somebody running a marathon. You'd like to think that if you've got a peer who's trying to climb Mount Everest, right, that you might cheer them on, right, that you wouldn't want to, fray their ropes, that you would actually want to see somebody succeed at a relatively difficult task. And by and large, my peer group in the world of poetry were not very favorably disposed, right? They really did frustrate the experience. Juries did not, fund the project. There wasn't a great deal of support from the community, right? I think the nature of peer review, for example, something that I would have thought early in my career was responsible governance, is actually hostile to innovation, right? That peer review is not incentivized to support peerlessness, right? And yet, peerlessness is what we want to see, right? In every epistemological domain, we want people to exceed, right, their own potential and to do things that are inconceivable, that look impossible, that are challenging, and that benefit, everyone, right? I've rehearsed here a set of techniques that could conceivably be used to store information in a manner which would prolong our civilization past its potential destruction, right? You could reconstitute your civilization in the wake of some planetary disaster, like thermonuclear warfare or astrophysical barrage, right? There's lots of cosmic threats that could befall us that are out there in the cosmos and await us, right? That could do damage to the longevity of our civilization. And I'd like to think that poetry has a role to play in the deep time of the cosmos, right? That poetry persists, beyond the lifetime of the sun, right? That poetry, addresses minds that are far away around other stars, right? Or that are distant in time, right? Deep, beyond the lifetime of our own solar system, right? That it's possible, right, to somehow say something beautiful or sublime, something uncanny, perhaps even something humorous or witty, in a manner which would testify to our existence long after our mortality as a species, right? And I'm making these claims about the work, right, thinking that these would be sale-worthy, right, that they would inspire others to offer support or at least not get in the way, and that hasn't been the case. And it was an immense amount of obstruction to overcome. Um, so I suppose if there's anything I get out of it, if there's an emotional charge from it, it's just the sense that I'm blessed, that I've been redeemed, and that my faith in the language itself was rewarded. Like at least I understood that it could be that if I put my faith in poetry, poetry would prevail, and it did.
Yeah. And so it's funny because closely related to, merging poetry with non-poetry, was there anything you did during this time that was not really directly related to this incredible project that helped in the progress? Like, did you exercise to keep yourself strong? Did you play board games and chess?
Well,
Your mind sharp? Did you live on a specific diet?
well, I have to say, I can't remember what I did. Like, like it was such a preoccupying force in my life. For 25 years, that's all I thought about. It's all I worked on, right? It was interleaved in nearly everything I did. I tried other things, did other kinds of artistic projects. I had other commissions, had other duties, right? I had jobs and commitments. I had distractions en route, sure, but it was something I worked on every day, and probably to the exclusion of good health and a decent, kind of life. I was very obsessed about getting it right. And it's that part of the background suffering that people aren't going to understand. Like it's not something that you can easily convey to people. Because everybody's trying to do. I think the best poets are certainly trying to do things that are infused with heartache and suffering and difficulty, right? Everybody's got their own obstructions and challenges that they have to overcome, right? And if you're the protagonist of your own life, those obstructions are the most important things to overcome, right? Somebody else's suffering, that's their problem, right?
Do you
Right.
have do you have any sense of like, and I'm not asking this to
Mm.
be sensational, it's just to educate, people that might
Yeah.
be on similar things. Do you have any sense of regret on this or no?
Well, let's put it this way. I think if I don't win in the end, right, whatever winning might be, then I might have regrets about it. But it'll be a great story if in the end you win, right? Like this is the nature of doing something heroic, right? The persistence required to do things uh, uh, just requires endurance. I suppose. I think if life is a test of merit then it doesn't matter how meritorious you are, you eventually fail. Right? You eventually graduate to an obstacle you can't overcome. Right? Your merits can get you only so far before they fail you. Right? Before you encounter something for which your skills are inadequate.
Mhm.
Um, but if life is a test of endurance, right? If it's a test of your capacity to keep going, to persevere, then when failure occurs, it almost always occurs on the threshold of success, right? You gave up too soon. Like had you just stuck it out a little longer, perhaps you could have, endured. You might have won, right? If you can find the resources within yourself to persist, despite the ineptitudes of your talent, right? Despite the shortfalls in your capacities, you might yet prevail. And to me, that's a more encouraging story to tell. I mean, it may be more painful to imagine, but I'd like to think that when we fail, we do so probably on the threshold of success. Had you persisted a little longer, perhaps the story could be different. And if you win under those circumstances, then it's a great story you get to tell. Uh, um, when I got the result of success, hitting all of the benchmarks that I needed to hit, all of them probably unlikely to occur simultaneously, very difficult benchmarks to meet. When I hit them all simultaneously, I promptly wanted to call one of my closest friends, oldest friends, and divulge to him this achievement. And when I brought up the topic, he immediately interrupted me, indicating that he would prefer that I quit this project, that it was ruining my life, and that I was only going to fail, that the failure would be more interesting than any success I could transmit, right? That I'd been working on it so long, surely all signs indicated that this thing was not worth doing. It was impossible. So, I had the pleasure, I suppose, of then saying to him, but look, actually, I'm about to tell you I succeeded at this. I triumphed over all of this adversity. That unlike, Orpheus who goes to hell and fails, right, to drag Eurydice back into the light, and, will always fail in that story. I managed to succeed. I went to hell and came back intact, and I, for a little bit at least, dragged Eurydice into the light here. I'm the poet who succeeded against all odds. The failure is not more interesting than the success, in my opinion, here. I wanted to be a poet that prevailed because failure is always presumed among poets, right? We're always trying to present failure as more poignant than a success. So in this respect, I would say that if I might regret not getting my marshmallow while I'm alive, right? But I'm not going to be around if I don't get it, right? If I die before I get the marshmallow, I'm not going to be around to regret it. And it would just seem to me that I've done something that will like it can't be really ignored for a prolonged period of time. People are going to have to take it into account that it's an immensely significant gesture to write a poem that literally can outlast the sun, like that it has that capacity to do that, even if conceptually, whether or not it actually does, the fact that it's in a form that could, and it's done in a manner which is so improbable, right? That it might testify, right, to the power of poetry in, against, the cosmos. Like it's implicit, buried, in these constraints. This thing exists. It's there waiting to be found, that buried within the actual language of life itself, there's a poem, right? That is durable enough to, outlast the sun. To me, that's an amazing discovery. That's something weird to be able to report on, right? Like I'm grateful I get to be the poet who says that, right? I'm the agent of that.
Yeah, to me,
Yep.
I would say what I'm most impressed by is I think 25 years is a cosmically short amount of time to achieve that. Within your lifetime, I think is almost beyond description. And it also showed me the kind of confirmed my suspicion that, true polymathy, which I know you've been described as,
Mhm.
it's kind of an illusion. I mean, it's kind of like that book, Little Big by John Crowley. It's like,
Mhm.
sure, it's just one big world. There's a lot in it that doesn't seem like
Yeah,
it's connected, but this was all you were working on for the past 25 years.
sure.
So yeah. And so, and now you know, you are a great person to ask this to, but I don't want to be sensationalist or be part of the
Sure.
fads du jour, as they say in French. So AI, is on the horizon. How do
Mhm.
you see it? Is it a collaborator, a competitor, something completely different of a
Well,
creative?
I'm going to annoy all my peers among poets. I actually don't care about AI at all. I think I think it will be a net boon to human well-being. All of the, um, I would say all of the data so far would suggest that it's going to be an important transition in human welfare that will generally be a net benefit. Like that, I'm optimistic about it, or probably more so than my peers in poetry, who are in many cases, very pessimistic about it. Um, in this respect, I think it would be like being a poet, very pessimistic about the printing press.
Mhm.
At the advent of Gutenberg. Now, it's true the printing press did occasion 100 years of religious warfare, and it's true perhaps that the mass distribution of knowledge was highly disruptive to most of our social formations of the time. But it, in the end, I think, has had an immensely demotic outcome, right? Empowering most of humanity and granting us a gigantic improvement in our general well-being. I think that the AI right now constitutes a pretty good collaborator. Like our relationship to it is in a process of experimentation. I mean, I think I dislike the idea that people will simply delegate the creative tasks uh, to an AI without care, right? That they might just simply demand that the thing write their essay for them, and we'll submit the essay as my dissertation, right, for a grade in school. I don't think that's a very useful way in which to exploit this particular affordance. It seems to me that there is more that you could do with it that would be a greater benefit to your creativity, to your potential, that would unlock greater aspects of your character, right? But I think most poets right now are frightened by it, don't know how to incorporate it into their toolkit. But I would say that the people who are most afraid of it are mediocrities. Like the geniuses don't care. Like they really are look at this and say, hey, great, a new tool that provides new avenues of exploration and new possibilities for innovation in my field. Fantastic. Like maybe labor saving components to its advent, immensely useful, opportunities for collaboration, or invention, exploration. There's all kinds of things that like it's true functionality is only just being guessed at right now. Um, so I'm not I'm somebody who's used it and exploited it, experimentally. I've written poetry with it, and made sure that people understand it's explicitly being deployed, so that people know what kinds of permissions it might grant you. I mean, like certain affordances it has, right? Possibilities that it makes available to you. Um, I look at it as a very exciting thing. It's like it will be immensely freeing to a lot of people and allow others to participate. Like for this reason, it's a largely demotic technology, and I think that's what some poets dislike about it, is that there will be people who can become poets without their permission, right?
Mhm.
That there are, gatekeeping kinds of attitudes about poetry that are going to be challenged by this innovation.
Yeah.
Uh, there are certain poets, I think, who can't feel confident about being a poet unless other people are doing it wrong. And again, I'm probably of the mind that there's no wrong way really to be a poet, and that using AI is just another way to be a poet, right? We don't know really what it'll be like, but I'm curious, right? And
Yeah.
I'm an experimental poet. I go where the experiments are, and that's one place where they are. So I'm there. I'm right on the forefront of that.
Yep. And only a few questions left, and these are all questions that I formulated from Anthony Mativier's amazing video about you.
Sure.
So talking about literature as storage, would you say that your body of work, and especially the impact that it has had, regardless of what it's, completely ignoring the reception that it has, but
Mm.
the objective nature that it's done, would you say that what you have done changes human understanding of literature, especially as it moves on from human memory to electronic memory to maybe microorganic memory? Do you feel that it's going to
Well,
reshape?
I could make very big claims about my accomplishments. I think I mean you can see that I'm predisposed to do so, but I actually don't know, like, really what impact my work might have. I have fantasies about it, but it's going to get exploited, for purposes for which I can't anticipate. On the one hand, while I've made explicit claims about, what I'm trying to do or how I'm, trying to be a poet, I think that, posterity is going to figure out on it, for itself what use it is, how it might benefit others. I'd like to think that a work like Eunoia, one of my early works, will have some endurance 100 years from now because it's a whimsical, athletic work. That's an expression of literature vue, that it's a singularity that people might take delight in, and it affords people a lot of permissions. I'd like to think that because I was one of the founding members of conceptualism, the first avant-garde literary movement of the 21st century, I might, persist in an encyclopedia on the subject of the history of literature because my gang, contributed important conversations, right, to our history, and that that legacy might be enduring. But I think that in the grand scheme of things, I hope it's the Xenotext, that has the enduring significance, at least of the work I've done so far. I hope that that becomes the thing that provides long-term appreciation, right? That stands in an immense pantheon of great people.
It might not
I
have a
would like to think
place.
I've done something, that would permit me to be named alongside a Joyce or a Milton or a Shakespeare, right? For at least one thing, right? Not perhaps for an entire oeuvre of work, but for one thing, right? That you've done, right? A single accomplishment that might stand up, right, against the grand monuments, the grand obelisks in the history of literature. So in this respect, I don't know, because the jury is out, right? My jury is in the future, right? The people who might make claims about me now are not going to be the people that ultimately, draw the conclusions, I think. Um, and I would like to think that there's still other adventures to embark upon. That the next thing I get to do will exceed even that achievement, right? That I can try to outclass or upstage myself still, right? One of the challenges of being a poet late in the career is that you find yourself competing with all of your earlier work, right? It's not just that you're competing with all of your peers, right, who
Yeah.
might be grand. It's not that you're competing necessarily with past greats, who are even, more important than you are and whose contributions are proven, right? You're also competing with your own work, right? Trying to upstage things that you've done that are, precede you, precede your current work. And you got to figure out how to navigate, that, right? Like, what can I do in the wake of the Xenotext? People have asked me that question, like, what do you do next? I suppose the sheepish answer would be to say, well, what are you going to do next? Because now you have to live in a world where this accomplishment exists, right? Like, how would you exceed it? Maybe I could take some notes, right? It would be good to know, right? Like, what would you do in response to it?
Yeah.
Um, I think I've got to provide you with an ambivalent answer, about the nature of the contribution. I don't know precisely what it would like. I certainly have my own fantasies about it, but the jury is out, right? Still, I think there's a lot of deliberation that goes into literary history.
Yeah, the Xenotext might not have a choice but to sustain.
Well,
Consider.
I have tried my best, right, to produce something that endures whether you like it or not, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. So
you know.
you described the bacterium as a co-author in the process of
Mm.
generating a second poem. Could you more transparently describe the relationship between your creative input as a poet and the biological input of the microorganisms?
Well, my naysayers will argue that I'm simply telling the organism what to do, that the organism has no creative role to play here. And that in fact, there's an immense amount of hubris here because I'm exploiting another organism for my own artistic purposes. Um, it's a very uncharitable way of understanding the project. And, it precludes thinking about our artistic relationship to living things, throughout human history, right? I mean, if you really think that it's wrong to manipulate an organism for aesthetic purposes, then you probably have to uproot your rose bushes and, euthanize your chihuahuas, right? Because they themselves are the product of tens of thousands of years of husbandry and aesthetic engineering. The engineering that I've done over the course of 25 years rather than 2,000 years, right?
Mhm.
Um, Moreover, the organism itself is a simple creature, right? To me, it's the ethics of transforming a dire wolf into a chihuahua is very undignified. Like I think that to me is an immensely unethical thing to have done to those poor creatures, right? Um, uh, uh, the the organism, can't just do whatever I tell it to do. It's very resistant to manipulation. I've had to conform to its demands of me. It's not conforming to my demands, right? There's no hubris in this. I have to approach it with an immense amount of humility, no matter what, kind of exploitative, attitudes I might have, when I show up on the scene. I can't make it do whatever I want. It's impossible to make it do whatever I want. It's so resistant, and I had to, make a lot of sacrifices of lucre and grief and blood, and effort, on the altar of this wee God. I would say that it feels like a small God to me, a private deity that has, extracted an immense tithe from me, right, in labor and effort, in order for me to become worthy of it, right, for me to be capable of conforming to its expectations of me. Everything I do, I have to do within its constraints that it imposes upon me. These constraints are, biogenetic and biochemical. They're a product of its own evolution, and I'm trying to establish a dialogue between my language, and its genetics, and it's resistant to all of that. It demands, that I conform to its constraints. So, the outcome is collaborative in this respect. I've had to adjust what I want to do, right, to make it feasible for it to accomplish this task. And as I said, it's buried within all of these relationships of chemistry and language. They're there, implicit within the constraints under which I have to write. And there's only one way to do it. When I point to this immense haystack, right? That's one novum quinquagentillion bits of straw in size. You might think that because it's large and a relatively open space, perhaps there are lots of needles, right? That it could be that because the scale of it makes it possible to find lots of ways to do it. But there's not. There's only one way to do it,
Mhm.
and being permitted to find it is a product of the organism's permission, right? It's not a product of my willfulness, so much. I just can't make it do whatever I want it. I have to do what it tells me to do.
Mhm. And then this is the last question. I love having very verbose guests on because sometimes you answer several questions at the same time
Sure.
and I've which makes it easy. So from everything I've gathered, including my research before talking to you, which I've known about for a long time,
Mm.
when I especially talk about when I hear about your insight, it really seems like to me the imagery that comes to my mind, I love Ezra Pound, I'm an imagist. So
Sure.
I it sounds like when you took on the Xenotext, it really was like confronting this big dark abyss. I remember you saying that with the next steps after you did the hardest task on the Xenotext, the problems got harder rather than
Yeah.
easier. And then you also said that if you had known the true scale of the project's difficulty, you might not have pursued it.
Yeah.
So, and since all we've kind of been doing, it was trying to get people excited about lesser known forms of poetry. Is there anything you can offer, because, I don't think you can really be ambitious enough as a human being. This all sounds very humanist. I'm not sure if you are, but this sounds very much like humanism to me. Like, how much can we achieve within a lifetime? So, what would you have to offer to people who, somewhere out there do have very ambitious, whether they have the means to or not, super cosmic ambitions, and how to really cope with the true scale of accomplishing something like the
Well,
Xenotext?
every task that you embark upon is going to be harder than you think. Even the hardest task will be harder than you think. Uh, Certainly, when I was working on this project, I knew that there were going to be difficult obstacles. I just understood that some tasks were going to be a challenge. I thought the challenges were tractable. I could see some of the boundaries of the problem. But every solution that I managed to discover after an immense amount of effort, something that was exhausting in its effort, just simply opened up and led to an even more difficult problem. I thought the hardest part would be writing the two poems. The two poems are written according to a Herculean constraint that should be really impossible. I discovered that it's virtually impossible to have written the two poems themselves before I even start embarking upon the engineering and the protein production. All of that stuff is was I thought was going to be a technologically tractable problem that would be solvable very quickly. But no, they turned out to be even harder than the task I thought was going to be quite impossible. Every single stage of it confronts a new degree of impossibility. And luckily I operated under the assumption that the language itself, that poetry was enough, right? That there was some avenue of resilience in all of this for me, that I could find the path if I was rigorous enough, if I was disciplined enough, if I could simply learn more, right? I would figure it out. And of course, I'm starting from zero. I'm not trained, of course, in genetic engineering or proteomic engineering. Part of the artistic exercise was to become fluent in that discourse and learn the skills required to accomplish the task. At least to be able to, solicit the help of scientists in a manner which made me look credible, right, rather than crackpot. And all of that is part of the artistic exercise. I would suggest that people always underestimate how hard something might be. It will always certainly be more difficult than you imagine. But you also underestimate your capacity to do it, right? People, I think, give up too soon because they don't know that they probably have it within themselves, right, to accomplish greatness. You have to accomplish something in order to show yourself that you can do it, right? And usually you have to do something that's harder than your current capacities, right? You have to reach a little further than your grasp permits you to do, right? You have to kind of extend yourself beyond a current level of comfort, I suppose, right? You have to endure discomfort. You probably have to look foolish. You have to admit a lot of ignorance, right? You have to, start from scratch. Really, you have to start from somewhere, right? Starting from where you're at is about the only place to start. And there's lots of paths to get you there, right? But finding it, you pretty much have to start where you're at. And breaking down the task into smaller tasks, was useful. I knew, that if I could just overcome this one problem, then surely, that would make that step would, make the next steps easier. That wasn't exactly true, but overcoming each of those individual steps led me to believe that I had the ability, that I was stronger than I thought I was more persistent than I thought I was, that I was smarter maybe than I thought I was, that I had untapped potential that I didn't know I had. Now, as I say, retroactively, I look back and wonder how did I find those resources? Because at the time, it's not immediately obvious that I have them. And even now, when I look back, I wonder who the hell is that guy who managed to accomplish this? It looks impossible to me now. Um, and I think that you have to understand that while the task might be harder than you think, you probably are stronger than you think in the face of it.
Mhm.
I would like to think that doing something like this, accomplishing a task like this that looks impossible and is highly unlikely, would nevertheless inspire others to imagine that they could realize some ambition or dream. Because really, I'm not a genius in genetic engineering or proteomic engineering. I have high school education in those subjects. I have 3 degrees in English literature for all the good that that's worth, right? But I like to think that because I had that training in English literature, it meant I could conceivably read anything, and with a little bit of research and effort, learn it, right? I mean, my feeling is if I have a PhD in English literature, I should be able to understand anything written in English. I should be able to, with a bit of effort, parse a scientific paper on the subject, right? That I should be able to learn the discourse over time. The only thing that's preventing me from doing so is the effort required.
Yeah. Are you aware of the thing called Hofstadter's law?
No, what is Hofstadter's law?
You know Douglas Hofstadter?
Of course I do. Yeah,
Yeah,
he wrote Made a Magical Themas and Go to Bach. These are great books by him. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah, so he has this thing called Hofstadter's law, and the only definition I haven't memorized, it's that simple. It always takes longer than you expect, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's certainly true.
Yeah.
In my case, that was it's not that it took longer; it was also much harder. And I feel blessed insofar as I did not know how hard it could be. If somebody had anticipated, in advance how difficult it was, if they were persuasive, in their evidence for how hard it would be, I might not have embarked upon it. I mean, calculating the odds now retroactively, if I had known those odds at the start, uh, I think that would have been discouragement enough not to have embarked upon it. So, my ignorance, feels a bit strategic here. Okay, like not knowing that it's impossible, really, right? A willingness to test, the claims made about its impossibility, served me in the end, right? Like, I think that and of course, evidence of prior success at something. I did other things that were hard, right? In the course of getting to the point where I embarked upon this task, I was trying to say, okay, well, I've done this one hard thing. Surely it means that I can do other things that are hard, maybe even harder, right? Maybe I can try test my capacities here a little. You know,
Yep.
I do at times though feel like I've tested myself to a point of really excruciating failure, right? That I've probably exhausted myself now. That I don't have an immense reserve of rocket fuel left, right, to do other things. I'm turning 60 this year, and I don't feel like I've accomplished enough in a 40 or 50-year career as a poet. I feel like there's a lot more to do, and there's time's running out. I've only done 2 or 3 great things, and I was hoping I would have a much larger repertoire of accomplishment at this point.
Yep. And then, so yeah, we got to all my questions, and I think this would be a great note to end on. I thought
Sure,
about this. I'm going to read you an excerpt from a book that I think is
sure.
perfectly in line with what you're doing. I actually did
Hmm.
talk about this on social media because there is a relatively compared to what you have put out, there's a pretty popular short video out there of you talking about the importance of poetry that is not serious.
Yeah,
And of course, it doesn't take long to guess who comes to mind. I mean, Joyce comes to mind.
sure,
A lot of the Russians from the Zao movement come to mind.
sure.
And it's kind of it's almost a paradox because you did take a part in possibly the most auspicious. I mean, and I mean that in a good way. I don't mean that in any
Hmm.
capacity, but you did accomplish, I think, the most auspicious, lofty goal that any poet has done, certainly in the 21st century. And I want to read you this excerpt from a book called Mastery by George Leonard. He was a Taekwondo expert that got interested in
Sure. Yeah, I'd be very curious to see what a Taekwondo expert has to say about mastery.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's at the end of the book, and I have the whole thing typed out. So it goes, how often have you censored your spontaneity out of fear of being thought childish? Too bad. Psychologist Abraham Maslow discovered a childlike quality. He called it a second naivety in people who have reached unusually high levels of their potential. Anthropologist Ashley Montego used the term neoteny from neonate, meaning newborn, to describe not only artistic or scientific geniuses such as Mozart or Einstein, but also those whose openness, playfulness, and resilience allowed them to thrive in many areas of life. What we frown at as foolish in our peers or in ourselves, we are likely to admire as eccentricities in celebrated figures across disciplines, rarely stopping to consider that the freedom to be foolish may well be one of the keys, not just to creative brilliance, but to progress, adaptability, and even to something as basic as learning itself.
Well, I would say that being foolish is an inevitable first step in all learning.
Mhm,
That you're gonna flub it, right? Like
mhm,
you're gonna make mistakes immediately. You're gonna look uncoordinated. You're going to look stupid. You're going to look clownish, right? In the effort to learn a new skill. And for better or for worse, everybody nowadays, right, is educating themselves in public, right? They're showing themselves learning how to acquire a skill, right? I'm trying to become a poet, early in my career. I'm trying to learn a new skill by becoming a scientist, mid-career. I'm trying to, accomplish things. And they're done in public now, right? Under the aegis of social media, in social settings of community, because of course you have to test these things out. You have to show, what you've accomplished at a certain point, and it's gauged against achievement by others, and of course predecessors. It's impossible, I think, to learn anything without looking like an idiot. And you have to be willing to take at least on some of that risk with a certain amount of finesse. I think you have to just simply say, it's okay for me to screw up in front of others here because I'm in a state of learning. Like I'm stumbling here. I'm trying to stutter my way through this. And the risk of something like the Xenotext is that every step of it, I'm failing. I'm doing something that is really hard, and the rocket is blowing up right on the pad every time, right? I've just wasted $100 million blowing up a rocket, right? And I've done it 6 times in a row, right? I've blown up I don't know how many launch pads, but it's the seventh time, right? I've spent $700 million and I finally sent it into orbit. And, six showed that it can be done, right? I mean, you have to think about the number of rockets that have to be blown up before you finally send, the Statue of Liberty into orbit, bring it back and land it on a boat, right? Upright, with the computer power of a phone, right? Like to me, to get to those kinds of accomplishments requires an immense amount of failure. And I would think that in Silicon Valley among engineers, right? You have to fail faster to get to success sooner, right? And you have to iterate the failure pretty quickly if you want to be able to get through those stages, taking the shortest possible road to expertise. I mean that's part of the embarrassment of working on something like the Xenotext is that many people got to watch me fail at various stages of it, and or struggle. They got to watch me struggle, and they enjoyed it. I mean, they're sadists, right? They thought it was cool that I was flunking here, and they didn't I think cheer me on, right? They're booing the marathon, right? You're a marathon runner, and they're standing on the sidelines booing. And I'd like to think though that if you're engaged in the process, right, if you're actually on a mission, then you understand something about being in the arena, right? Being bloody, being sweaty, being challenged, right? That transcends being on the sidelines. You know, those who complain the most, those who are the critics the most, they do the least. And the world is the history remembers the people who accomplished things, right? Who did things. Even against the great odds, right? We care about those people eventually.
It's
So
easier to
I
critique.
think
It's
yeah,
easier to
I'd
critique than
like to, as I
succeed.
said, it'll be a great story. Whatever story I get to tell about my life, it'll be great if I win. It's no good if I lose, though. If you're struck down in
Yeah.
the arena, no, it's not a great story. It's tragic and stupid, right?
This is this is a great note to end on because even I did doing this podcast with the faulty
Mm.
Wi-Fi upstairs. So
Yeah.
it's universal. So
Yeah, 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 absolutely. But it also lends credibility, right, to the experience you've had here, right? It'll be honest and sincere and authentic,
human.
right? People are going to appreciate that, I think, in the end.
Thank you. All right. So this
Right?
has been John Burness hosting Christian Bök on sound poetry. This podcast is dedicated to Craig Dworkin and in memory of Daniel Dennett. And Christian Bök, thank you so much for
Oh,
taking.
thank you, John, for being so enthusiastic. I appreciate having the opportunity to carry on a conversation with you, and I appreciate your listenership for being so tolerant of my verbosity. Thank you so much. Cheers,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yep. Bye-bye. Thank you.